One of the biggest questions that I get is about the weather. So I brought on an expert today with Josh Marthers, a real live meteorologist here in the wild at Low Tide Brewing on Johns Island to answer all of your questions. What's up, everyone? Welcome back. As always, I'm Bill Olson, your favorite YouTubing realtor, and I'm here with my new friend, and I'm kind of fanboying out here because I've been a fan for a while. Josh Marthers.
I've been here for a minute. 14 years in one spot is a long time for somebody who does what I do.
So I'm so glad that you could join me. Cheers.
Yes, absolutely. Glad to be here.
Yeah.
Glad to be here,
Have
Bill.
a couple beers, and we're going to tell you all about the weather, and I want to start big.
Yeah.
So let's talk the biggest weather we have here, and that's, of course, the hurricanes.
What, sunshine?
The sunshine, like
yeah,
today.
like today,
Yeah.
and most of the days here.
80 and sunny.
Yeah.
And then hurricanes.
Hurricanes, that's the thing, and social media has a lot to do with this, and the fact that we have 24-hour cable news. Something that you have to kind of put in perspective here is I think most folks that have never lived in a coastal area, never lived with hurricanes, think that this is something that just comes as one huge thing and just wipes out the entire coastline. Well, that's not really the case. The worst of that weather is in a very, very small area right near the center of the storm. Now, the storm surge itself can go out hundreds of miles from the center, and that depends on things, the shape of the coast and the lowering of the pressure, all these things that I get to worry about that you don't really need to. But it is so important to stress that the odds of you in your town, in your location, of taking a direct hit from a hurricane is so extraordinarily low. And it just doesn't happen that often.
And I'm glad you mentioned something in that it can stretch hundreds of miles.
Yeah.
Because I have a lot of clients that, we want to move to Somerville, but 30 miles, 20 miles from where we are, because there's less of a chance of getting hit by a hurricane. Now,
well, it's different.
It's different, but the storms are the size of the state.
Right. and you're gonna, in Somerville, for example, you're gonna have the wind, you're gonna have the rain, you're gonna have the tornado threat. You have a flooding threat, not necessarily from storm surge, but remember, a lot of our landfalling tropical systems produce rain in feet, not necessarily inches sometimes. And if you're inland, believe it or not, most hurricane deaths occur from inland flooding. They come from that heavy rain and the inland flooding plus the storm surge. Water is the thing that causes the big issue.
So we're safer on Johns Island.
I wouldn't say that now, Bill. But it just depends on the. Actually, you know what? Frankly, you might be right. And this is what I say on TV all the time. Every storm has its own personality. Each one is different. You think about Hurricane Andrew back in 1992. This was a very small, compact storm. It was a buzzsaw. Produced hardly any storm surge, hardly any rain, but it had wind gusts up to 200 miles per hour around its eye wall. It was just this little tiny buzzsaw. Then you go to a storm like Hugo, which is our benchmark hurricane, this large storm that could cover 3 or 4 states, and its main thing was storm surge. It produced a 15 to 20 foot storm surge up the coast, but it didn't do a lot of heavy rain and flooding because it was moving so quickly. It was a wind and storm surge type hurricane. They all have their own unique little personalities, and that's what we try to figure out as it's coming in, what it's going to be. And you'll hear me say this. We've been through a few of these storms over the past 5 years. I'll always say, I think Matthew's legacy is going to be water. I think this one's legacy is going to be wind. That's what I said about Dorian. I think Dorian's legacy would be wind, and that's what it was. It was an 80-mile-per-hour wind gust for hours. It's so incredibly low risk of you getting that. People kind of get worked up over this stuff for there are other things to worry about.
Yeah. So with hurricanes, what's actual hurricane season? Because it's longer than most people think, with the active part being what most people know of.
Officially on the books, it's June 1st to November 30th. Realistically, though, first, second week of May, the ocean is warm enough to start for these things what I call homebrew to develop, which is stuff that's close to the coast of either the Carolinas, Florida, or the Gulf of Mexico. It's right here by the United States, hence homebrew. That can start in May. You don't see a lot of those waves coming off of the African continent. Those don't really start going until July, August, September into October. And then in November, you're back to that kind of a setup where an old frontal boundary gets caught in the Caribbean, it flares up, you get an area of low pressure, it develops and then moves north into the Gulf or out to sea. But really the heart of the worst of hurricane season is really July through September. That's the peak time, even into early October. But you know, we've had tropical storms move onshore here in the Carolinas in May, and that's not out of the question. They're typically weak, but it can happen.
What is your biggest piece of advice for someone who's afraid of hurricanes or concerned when moving to Charleston?
The first thing I say is whenever we get into that time period, about 5 days out before one's going to make a close approach to the coast, I always just say, breathe. This is going to change every 6 hours for the next 5 days. Don't get caught up in every little adjustment to the track forecast. Stay away from spaghetti models. They're garbage. They're for us. They're not for you, because we're able to look at it and go, well, that one's not right because it's doing that. That one's not right because it does that. Well, this one's probably right because we know it does good in these situations. You don't get caught up in that stuff, okay?
We always hope for that one that curves and
usually
that
zigzags
one's backwards, that we know is not going to happen, but we always hope for it.
Well, it's always funny when you say that, because you're like, well, what about that one? It looks funny, but it's doing that. There's a reason it looks funny. You know, there's a reason that happens. You know, I just always say, just breathe. Because we got lots of time, and the threat of you getting hit by the worst case scenario is so astronomically low. Now, that's not to say it doesn't happen, because it does happen.
Yep.
We're lucky. We're kind of tucked in. Our coast does this, and something's got to come right at us for us to take a direct hit.
With hurricanes comes rain. You know, let's talk about just the general rain that we get being coastal.
Yeah.
Because we do get a lot of rain, and you know, one thing I do want to touch on, because I've never understood this.
Okay.
Over the summer, there's always like a 20% chance of rain every day.
Usually. Yeah.
What does that actually mean?
It means where you're standing in the current setup and the conditions that are expected, it would produce a 2 in 10 chance of rain for that day.
Okay, and we have those high chances mainly because of the humidity.
Yeah,
correct.
It's what we call air mass thunderstorms. What happens? It's kind of like boiling a pot of water. Right there, when it first starts to boil, you'll see there's little bubbles that come up. Mm-hmm. It's not a rolling boil, but it's like bloop, one there, bloop, one there. It's the same principle. You've put enough heat in the atmosphere to eventually it's at the point to where the air starts to rise and it breaks the cap and thunderstorms go up.
And then 20 minutes later it's gone.
It's done.
And 10 minutes later it's dry.
Correct.
Because it's
and
97
more
degrees.
humid than it was before.
When you see the humidity rising off of the street.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. But that's really only a couple months out of the year with that humidity.
Yeah, those air mass type thunderstorms typically start late May and last until about early September every afternoon. And frankly, they're kind of a good thing because they give us a break from the heat. I mean, I've seen us on 100 degree days get knocked down into the 70s. Yeah, we warm back up into the 80s when they're done, but it still doesn't feel anywhere as bad as it did, you know, a few hours beforehand. So they're kind of a good thing, and it helps the lawns. You know, you don't have to water as often and things like that. I mean, it's really not that bad.
Yeah, and it's just a couple months out of the year, and the rest of the year is fairly mild.
Yeah, and our springs are wonderful. Our falls are wonderful.
Today, beautiful spring day.
Funny, we're talking about that. You know, just to kind of give everybody an idea, you know, the old saying is April showers bring May flowers. That doesn't, well, but you know what? There's a reason for that. April is statistically one of our driest months. Looking at climatology, our 2 driest months of the year are April and November. What are our 2 most comfortable months? April and November, you know, and a lot of that carries into the middle part of May, and we really start to see that dry period begin in the fall. The air starts to dry out, it stays warm. The ocean is still swimmable in mid to late October.
Yep.
Water temperature is still well into the 70s, and some warmer years even near 80, and that can carry you into November.
So with hurricanes, what's actual hurricane season? Because it's
Yeah.
longer than most people think,
Yeah.
with the active part being what most people
Right.
know of.
Officially on the books, it's June 1st to November 30th. Okay? Realistically, though, first, second week of May, the ocean is warm enough to start for these things what I call homebrew to develop, which is stuff that's close to the coast of either the Carolinas, Florida, or the Gulf of Mexico. It's right here by the United States, hence homebrew. That can start in May. You don't see a lot of those waves coming off of the African continent. Those don't really start going until July, August, September into October, and then in November, you're back to that kind of a setup where an old frontal boundary gets caught in the Caribbean, it flares up, you get an area of low pressure, it develops and then moves north into the Gulf or out to sea. But really the heart of the worst of hurricane season is really July through September. That's the peak time, even into early October. But you know, we've had tropical storms move onshore here in the Carolinas in May, and that's not out of the question. They're typically weak, but it can happen.
You can have a bad Category 1 or
Right.
a tame Category 4 relatively.
Well, let's think about Irma back in 2017. I mean, Irma was a tropical storm, and it was inland over southwest Georgia, and it produced a ton of storm surge on the South Carolina coast just because of where it was and the trajectory of the wind coming up the Florida Panhandle right up into southeast Georgia and South Carolina.
They're all different.
Yeah,
Do what you feel safe doing with you and your family.
that's exactly right.
That's why we all have generators. To keep things
my
running.
Main point, right. My main point on all of this is it's impact, not category. Everybody gets caught up in designation, is it a storm or a hurricane, and then what category is it? The category only measures wind speed. It does not measure amount of rain. It does not measure storm surge. It also does not measure the duration of the wind. If you got a Category 1 hurricane that stalls out and sits here for 36 hours with 90-mile-per-hour winds, or a Category 3 that comes through with 120 and it's gone in 20 to 30 minutes, which one would you rather have? You know, you got to think about
the
the
quick.
impact, not necessarily the category.
I want to take that into our 1,000-year flood
Right,
few years
back
ago.
in October 2015.
Because a lot of people remember seeing that on the news,
Mm-hmm.
and you know there was a lot of flooding. The two storms kind of sat on
Yep.
top of us for what seemed like 40 days and 40 nights.
And it was only 72 hours.
Right.
but it was the longest 72 hours of my life, I can tell you that.
I had to kayak out of my neighborhood. What I want to talk about is a little bit into flooding. It's not your area of expertise because that's water coming up.
Yep.
You are water coming down.
We've kind of had to get used to the other two, so we can talk about both.
So I briefly want to touch on it because that always comes up with
Yeah.
weather. And I've got another video on flooding I'm going to link to at the end of this about flood zones for you guys
Yep.
to watch. So let's just talk a little bit about when we get these heavy downpours and we see water in the roads.
Yep.
You know, the Weather Channel shows everyone on their roof getting rescued by a little John boat
Yep.
anytime it rains.
Yep.
It's not like that.
It's not. No.
Everything, it drains quick,
It does.
and it
most
takes a
times,
storm,
Yep.
2 storms for 72 hours.
For you to get that wide spread where everybody's seeing it. Yeah, most of the time our flooding here is fairly isolated. It makes headlines because it can be fairly impactful where it is, but it's isolated. And it's mostly confined to those hot spot areas in downtown Charleston, right along Lockwood Boulevard, over by the Citadel, into the medical district. You've got a few spots like over in Mount Pleasant around Long Point Road that'll typically flood, just around the Boone Hall area, and headed toward the Long Point neighborhood. There's a little stretch there that's fairly low. It kind of sits down in the marsh. That'll take on water. Some neighborhoods right around Shim Creek get some water at times.
But nothing up like into the houses. It's
right.
don't drive through it for an hour,
Right.
and you'll be fine.
9 times out of 10, that's exactly right. Yeah. It can get a little escalated at times in the national news
Yep.
compared to what's actually going on. it's a travel thing more than not. You know,
Right.
it's going to take you extra time to get from
10
point A
minutes
to
longer.
point B. Yeah, I mean, you know, now occasionally there will be that one instance where you can't get through the crosstown and it locks everything down, and you know it just kind of freezes the town up for a few hours. But that again does not happen very often. You got to have the right setup, the right type of storm, sit right over downtown at the right time, which is usually just before high tide.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the things that come together, and what are the odds of those things coming together exactly right. More than a couple of times a year? You know, they just don't.
Yep. It creates an inconvenience.
Yes.
And really, you know, do your due diligence, of course, when you're moving here, but for the most part, you're just gonna...
We call it nuisance flooding is what it's called typically.
Yep.
There are those big events, though, that we occasionally get, and you're going to get plenty of notice on those. We don't miss big events anymore, you know, and that's the key point I want to make too. You know, I know there's that old joke about, oh, it's the only profession that can be wrong 50% of the time and still get 100% of their paycheck. You know, that's been around for 50 years. We don't miss big events anymore. We know they're coming. Mm-hmm. And that's the comfort level that you can take in knowing if you're coming here. We're going to know if a hurricane's coming. We're going to know if one of these big events is coming. They don't just turn.
Yeah.
We thought they did at one point, but now we know there are things that make them do that.
Right.
You know?
It's like a turtle. It slowly comes and slowly turns.
That's exactly right.
You did a lot of schooling.
That's right.
And you've done this for, what, 14 years?
14 years here in this one spot.
So you're very familiar with all of the weather patterns.
Right, and Rob Fowler, who's with us, I'm the morning guy. Rob's in the evening. He's been here for more than
67.
30.
Don't let him watch.
We're not going to let him know you said that. He said it, I didn't. He's been here for more than 30. I mean, between the two of us, there's not much that we haven't seen.
Yeah.
We've seen about everything.
Yeah. Now, if you guys want to know exactly what's going on here and you don't live here, I urge you, follow Josh on Instagram, because just about every morning you do the
You've
update.
got something.
And also, man, about town, you can get the weather and then figure out where to go to dinner.
Yeah.
Because he's always out at the latest hot spots with
I do
your
my
Low
best.
Country Eats.
Yep.
And he's just a great person to follow. He's a great resource.
Thank you.
And so I urge you to go and follow him. Thanks so much, Josh. Thanks for joining us today.
Glad to be here.
We could shed some light on hurricanes and major weather systems here in Charleston.
Most of our days are like this, though.
Yeah. It's 82 degrees.
This is what most of our days are like. So.
Yeah.
Cheers,
well,
buddy.
Cheers.